So I'm going to talk about the web and communist political propaganda, democracy in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. So it's not the lightest topic for a Thursday afternoon. It's also quite complicated. So I will probably be giving a very top level overview. And yeah, I might be skimming over some significant things, but yeah. So why did I want to talk about this? It's not necessarily a traditional tech talk, but I just went to Cambodia, for anybody that I haven't already spoken to about it, and it was really interesting, and I discovered some things that I didn't know, and talked to some really interesting people, and it reminded me it's not all doom and gloom. It might not seem like genocide is the topic to remind you of that, but it reminded me what's cool about the web and social media, and so I thought I would share it with people. So I use some terms that people might be less familiar with or that kind of need a bit of definition. So Khmer, which refers to the people of the Khmer Empire, officially the Angkor Empire, which is the predecessor state to the modern Cambodia. Cambodia is also referred to as Kampuchea by the Cambodian people, and propaganda, which you can define in a lot of ways, but for the purposes of this, I refer to it as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view, which is the Oxford English Dictionary definition. So kind of, I've broken this down into different periods of time. 1954 to 1975 is the kind of pre-Khmer Rouge period. So in 1954, Cambodia won independence from France under King Sihanouk, and the king became really, really popular. It becomes the Kingdom of Cambodia. So he becomes so popular that in 1955 he abdicates to pursue a political career, and his father becomes king and he becomes prime minister. And so Cambodia is now completely under the power of one family. So in 1960, Sihanouk's father dies and he becomes head of state. In 1970, then, General Lon Nol overthrows Sihanouk in a coup and becomes the prime minister of a US-backed regime called the Khmer Republic. Sihanouk, in exile in communist China, forms a guerrilla movement and joins forces with the Khmer Rouge. Over the next few years, the Cambodian army loses territory against the communist Khmer Rouge guerrilla leaders led by a guy called Pol Pot, whose real name is Thalasar. So people might have heard of him before. He's kind of up there with like Hitler and Stalin, but Pol Pot isn't his real name. It's actually short for political potential, which is kind of like a name that he gave to himself. So in 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge are in power. So in 1975, General Lon Nol is overthrown by the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, who occupy Phnom Penh, which is the capital. Sihanouk briefly becomes the head of state. In 1976, Sihanouk resigns and Pol Pot becomes prime minister. So to give you some statistics, during the 4 years that the Khmer Rouge were in power, about 2 to 2.5 million Cambodians died of starvation, execution, disease, or overwork, which is out of a population of just 7 million. So over the course of 4 years, about a third of the population died. One consequence of this is that 50% of the current population is under the age of 24. You can see this in this graph. So between kind of 0, so this is from 2016, between 0 and 40, the population, or 0 and kind of 34, is pretty stable. And then after that, you can see this really sudden drop off. So that it correlates to the time that the Khmer Rouge were in power, and then kind of the couple of years afterwards. So you can see that really big drop off because not just kind of adults were killed, and you can see that as well, but children and women and everybody. And so there was this huge population shift. And it means it's really strange when you're there, because until somebody points it out to you, you don't necessarily notice, but there's no older people. Everybody is young. And it's a really strange environment to be in, and it's so different from kind of like the aging population that we have. So this is what the UK population looks like. It's a totally different shape of a graph. So in 1978, a group of Khmer Rouge broke away from the main group and fled to Vietnam in order to get support from the Vietnamese army. so that in 1979, the Vietnamese take Phnom Penh, the capital. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge forces flee to the border region with Thailand. So what happened next? So between 1973 and 2013, in 1979, the People's Republic of Kampuchea is a fragmented coalition government which is formed by Vietnamese puppets competing for power with the former Khmer Rouge officers and the Sihanouk supporters. In 1985, a guy called Hun Sen becomes prime minister. In 1993, general elections are held, supervised by the United Nations. Another coalition government is formed, including the Cambodian People's Party, the CPP, and Hun Sen becomes deputy prime minister. In 1994, thousands of Khmer Rouge guerrillas surrender in government amnesty. And that's one of the themes of what happened, is that a lot of people were given amnesty by the government, by the UN, and that's one of the things that makes the current population really, really angry. That and the kind of lack of justice of the officials that were in power at the time. So in 1996, the deputy leader of the Khmer Rouge is granted amnesty, so more amnesty by the king. In 1998, Pol Pot dies in a forest hideout in mysterious circumstances, having never been brought to trial, and the Khmer Rouge finally disintegrates. So that's the other theme, is that there wasn't an awful lot of kind of justice. And so a lot of people went unpunished, including Pol Pot. So although he was given a life sentence, he was under house arrest. And then when he died in mysterious circumstances in 1998, then he became kind of a figurehead, and a lot of what happened kind of became blamed on him, even though it wasn't one person that carried out what happened. It was a lot more than that, but he kind of became the figurehead for that. So in 2007, a UN-backed tribunals begin questioning Khmer Rouge suspects about allegations of genocide. So in 2012, the former S-21 prison commander, Dutch, is sentenced to life in prison for genocide and crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, the trials of 3 other Khmer Rouge higher-ups begin. So a few people were put on trial, and in total it was 5 people in the kind of top level government at the time that of the Khmer Rouge that got put to trial, 2 of which died before they even went to trial. One of them then was in prison first, and then the other 2 a few years later. So what next? So in 2013, there's another set of parliamentary elections. The ruling party, the CPP, claimed victory, but opposition alleges widespread irregularities, but Parliament approves a new 5-year term for Hun Sen. And mass protests begin in Phnom Penh over the contested election results and over the elected president Hun Sen, as the Cambodian people start to uncover some of the propaganda that they've been exposed to since the start of the Khmer Rouge regime. This includes the fact that Hun Sen, who's been in power for almost 30 years at this point, since 1985, is a former Khmer Rouge officer. So in 2014, 2 senior Khmer Rouge leaders get sentenced to life in prison, and these are the first top Khmer Rouge figures to be jailed. In 2016, a political commentator and prominent critic of the Prime Minister is shot dead in the capital. And this is the other thing that's a really big theme, is corruption in the government, and the questionable things that happen to silence anybody that speaks out against the government, despite the fact that it's not a one-party country and it is technically a democracy. But so what changed in and around 2013? Does anybody want to guess? Yes. So both of those, right? They got access to the web and they got access to social media. They had the freedom to access information for themselves, the Cambodian people. They were no longer limited to the corrupt traditional media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio, which the government had a really strong amount of control over. The other thing that's interesting to note is, how is this different to what happened in Arab Spring and what's happening in China and Russia? And I think the main difference is that Cambodia is technically a democracy. It's listed and it's internationally recognized as a democracy. And because of this, the Cambodian government aren't allowed to limit the population's access to the internet the same way that they do in other countries like China. And so the dynamics are different because they're listed as democracy. So why did I talk about this? Because, as I kind of said at the beginning, the web and social media are awesome. And it reminded me of the good things that it can do. I think at the moment we hear a lot about fake news and the problems with the US and the Brexit and how the web and social media are bad and how they're bad for political propaganda. But I disagree. They can be, and they definitely have been. But they aren't always, and I think they can enable democracy, they can emancipate people, and they can give people the freedom to access information for themselves and make decisions for themselves. They have access to both sides of the story, in theory, if they seek it, and so then they can make decisions for themselves. Thank you. Are there any questions? Cool.
So the situation in Cambodia was that as they got the internet, they got social media, they realised actually we've been lied to for all these years, the propaganda machine starts to break down, and they go, okay, right, actually we're to take control of our country. And there is an argument that in the United States people have done exactly the same thing, and in exactly the same time frame. Since 2013, 2017, people have said, oh look, the media are lying to us, CNN's lying to us, ABC is lying to us, the New York Times is full of liars and hypocrites, and as a result we've ended up with a political system that some might consider not ideal. So is there a difference in the dynamic, populations? Is it?
I think slightly, although not totally, but the main difference, I would say, but I mean, anybody is welcome to share their opinion, is that America isn't a one-party government, and they have had choice for a while, and it's very different, and they have a lot of arguments about that. Whereas Cambodia was technically not one party, but it was, and so they didn't have that choice between the two, although, I mean, it's difficult, but I think it is slightly different, but it's similar in a lot of ways. And the freedom to have access to that information for yourself only goes so far as your ability and your desire to seek that information. So I think, and it was something Jamie asked about, was, fake news is kind of the same thing. And if you only go so far as to seek one version of the truth, then, and that's the one that's kind of freely accessible, then that's all you have. The Cambodian government didn't really use the internet for propaganda. And so it was a different dynamic, whereas in the US, it was used for propaganda. But as soon as they kind of get on that train, in theory, then that's what you get exposed to. But if you only seek, you could, even in America, you have one version of the truth, and if people stop looking there, then you won't have that freedom, but you could keep looking and get more information. Yeah.
I got two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one is, when on holiday in Cambodia, did you listen to any dead Kennedys?
No. I don't know what that is. Okay, sorry.
So the serious question is,
Who under 30 got that?
We
are
we getting too used to democracy so we don't take it for granted? And now with fake news, are we actually becoming less interested in it? Because now it's like, well, it's all just fake. So we're the democratic continent.
Yeah.
Which has had peace for like 7 years.
Yeah.
Ish. And so is the next level of web and social media potentially going to be around like fact checking the sort of fake news can't exist?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think, yeah, the fake news stuff is dodgy, but to say the least. But I guess you raise a good point that we probably take it for granted, and they definitely don't. So even though they know that their vote might not be actually taken account for, they all go to vote. It's so important. They don't take it for granted, because it wasn't that long ago that they didn't have that choice. And the other thing that's really interesting is they re-elected. So the Khmer Rouge are in power and unelected, but the people before that, they've had a lot of like civil wars over the last kind of 50 years. And so after the Khmer Rouge were like pushed out of power, they then kept re-electing the same person, and they re-elected the person that got put in place by the Vietnamese government, because they had this real distinctive fear of change. Because what had happened in the past was every time that they had changed the government, they had huge civil war. And so they were afraid to change, which is it was a totally different outlook. So they chose to re-elect these people that they didn't necessarily support, because of that fear of actually taking up the ability to, like, they voted, but they didn't necessarily vote who they wanted to vote for, because they were afraid. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah. Observe.
And it's that situation in America, and it's about fake news. Fake news is not, people talk about fake news. It's a thing that just kind of happens. People have an appetite for fake news, and they want it. Whereas the whole fake news phenomenon came about because it's incredibly well-funded, clearly thought-out strategy by some ruthless, and I will not hesitate to use the word evil people to capture the political process. So I think, I'd suggest that what's happening in Cambodia, and we're talking about, it's not like a natural conversation that can happen when people have access to the media. And then what happened in America is that you've got a layer of very deliberate propagandizing and political engineering that was funded and ruthlessly executed on top of that conversation.
Yeah.
That completely subverted it.
I think it's really interesting to see the two things, and I had like a day to prepare, and so I could know more about what's happening in America, and to make the comparisons really clear. But what's interesting is seeing them happen in parallel at very different stages of like political history, but having the internet and the web as this very different dynamic force. So a lot of the things that happen in Cambodia have been happening for a very long time, but they're just happening now for them. And the internet and the web is changing how that plays out. And historically that hasn't been true. And so it's changing the dynamic of that a little bit. So now they have access to look those things up for themselves, but the government weren't kind of ahead of the game in order to already be using the web for propaganda. They were still in the traditional world. And then by comparison to what's happening in the US, it's different, but there's comparisons that can be made, I think. Any other question? Yeah. Guns. In Cambodia, they just have like trees with very, very sharp, like the, I think they're mango trees. They have very sharp, or palm trees, edges, and they use them to like chop people's heads off. But it was very painful. They use it like a saw. They're very sharp. Yes. Yes.
That's right.